I will next call on Peter Heuser to present the majority report with respect to ballot measure number 10 on victims' rights.
Thank you. Before getting into the measure, I'd like to introduce the members of the committee. They are Kathy McFerrin, Susan Quick, George Ivan Smith, Marilyn McDonald Smith, Corey Streisinger, and Richard Tracy. I'll first briefly describe the most important provisions of the measure and then comment to the extent the entire committee agrees. After that, I will summarize the reasons why, for the majority's feeling, why the measure is a good one and why it should be passed into law. The measure first provides that at the request of a victim or witness, his or her identity or address is not to be given to the defendant. We didn't hear any testimony against this provision. The measure also provides that when defense attorneys contact victims during their pretrial investigations, they must first inform the victims, first of the identity of the person contacting them, second of the victim's right not have to talk to that person, and third, that the victim has the right to have a district attorney present for that interview. The measure requires that every pretrial release order is to prohibit contact with the victim. If, despite this order, the defendant threatens or intimidates the victim, the defendant's release is to be revoked and bail is to be set in an amount sufficient to ensure the safety of the victim. This provision, we feel, would discourage contact by the defendant, which is a real concern to many victims. It's the present practice to prohibit victims from attending the trial if they are to be called as witnesses. The measure would change this practice to permit victims to attend a trial. The measure provides that jointly charged defendants are to be tried together unless clearly inappropriate. This is not the present practice in Oregon courts, although it is in the federal system, and this seems to be working pretty well. This change would prevent victims from having to repeat their testimony at separate trials, which can be very traumatic, especially for victims of violent or sex crimes. Another section deals with the admissibility of prior felony convictions to attack the credibility of defendants who are taking the stand. Under the present practice, in order to determine whether to admit such evidence, the judge has to weigh the probative value of the evidence against the prejudicial effect. The measure would eliminate this balancing test in most cases and would require that the prior felony convictions be admissible, although the jury would be instructed that that evidence is only to be considered for the purposes of determining whether or not the defendant is telling the truth. Other sections of the measure give victims the right to testify at sentencing and parole hearings. Also, in most cases, the period of active parole is to be increased from 6 months to 3 years. Admittedly, this would increase the cost of parole operations, but the committee feels that the money would be well spent because it would encourage accountability by former inmates and could reduce recidivism. The extended parole period might encourage earlier release from incarceration, and obviously parole is far less expensive to the state than incarceration, and we're all well aware of the acute shortage of jail space in the state. It has been estimated that the cost of the measure would be approximately $2 to $4 million per year, but that estimate is very rough because it does not take into account possible savings resulting from the measure. I'll now speak as a representative of the majority of the committee which recommends passage of the measure. When our committee began to look at the measure several months ago, I think many of us were quite skeptical. We all knew that the City Club had considered another measure only 2 years before and had voted against it. But after studying the measure fully and talking to over 25 witnesses, we recognize that this measure is very different from the prosecutor's wish list of the prior measure. Several of the measures of Measure 10, several of the provisions of Measure 10 codify what is now the extending practice in Multnomah and some other counties in the state. We heard very little testimony against many of these provisions, and the minority has no complaint about them. They would establish uniform practices all over the state, and they would ensure their continuation long after the present administrators have moved on to other positions. The minority really only objects to 4 of the 14 different provisions in the measure. The first is that which requires defense attorneys to inform the victim of his or her identity and to tell the victim that they need not talk without a district attorney present. We heard testimony that this would have little effect upon the interviewing process because most victims would talk anyway as long as the defense attorney is cordial and upfront. Those victims who are ill at ease should have the right to have a representative present, because this can be a very troubling and confused time and is often the first time that victims have any contact at all with the criminal justice system. The section which permits victims to attend the trial is another one to which the minority objects. Many victims feel they should be able to attend the trial of an offense directed against them. The argument raised by the minority that this would permit victims to listen to the testimony of others and to tailor their answers and testimony accordingly is not overly persuasive. Witnesses obviously talk to each other outside of the courtroom, so if they're inclined to tailor their testimony, they'll do it anyway, even if they're not there during the testimony of the prior witness. The provision to which the minority objects most vehemently is the section which limits the judge's power to exclude prior felony convictions from evidence when the defendant takes the stand. We're all responsible for our actions, and whatever we do is either held against us or goes to our credit from that point on. This is all the measure requires. It makes sense that one who commits a felony would be less likely to tell the complete truth when testifying on their own behalf. The jury should have this information about the defendant, and under the present practice, such evidence may not come in. In those few cases where prejudicial effect substantially outweighs the probative value, the judge apparently still would have the power to keep that evidence out. The final provision to which the minority objects is that which defines who constitutes the victim. While we would have liked to see this provision worded a little differently, it is likely that the courts will narrowly construe that definition. If such a construction is not possible, the legislature can easily narrow the definition. This definition is certainly not so troublesome that it should cause the entire measure to be voted down. In conclusion, the public has in recent years expressed real dissatisfaction with the criminal justice system. One reason for this dissatisfaction is the feeling that the system treats the defendant far better than the victims of their crimes. The measure would tend to restore the balance between the defendants and their victims. This should foster more respect and backing for the criminal justice system at a time that it's sorely needed. Mr. Chairman, I hereby move that the City Club adopt the recommendation of the majority of the committee and that ballot measure 10 be approved at the November 4 general election.
Thank you, Peter. Is there a second to the motion? It's been moved and seconded that the report be adopted, which recommends favorably on the measure. I'll now recognize Corey Streisinger speaking for the minority of the committee.
Despite its name, ballot measure 10 is really not a victims' rights measure. It does very little to actually assist victims, but it does quite a bit to prejudice the rights of criminal defendants. First, with respect to what this measure does not do for victims. The committee heard considerable testimony that what really makes the difference for a victim's participation in the criminal justice system is the existence of a strong victims assistance program, such as we do have here in Multnomah County. With a victims assistance program to assist the victim, virtually anything that is guaranteed by this measure can already take place. We also heard considerable testimony that in actual practice, this measure will make very little difference in the way that victims are treated. Although victims are given the right to have input at various stages of the process, in fact, the system is not set up to give any weight to their input. In effect, this is a cosmetic measure that is intended to make victims feel better while not really changing the way that they are treated. In contrast, the impact on criminal defendants and their rights is very substantial. Although there are a number of problems with this measure, I'd like to just discuss a few of them here. The most prejudicial section of this measure is probably Section 9, which deals with the introduction of evidence of prior convictions. Prior convictions may be admitted in a criminal trial when the defendant testifies only for the purpose of impeaching the defendant's credibility. In other words, showing that he is not telling the truth. They are inadmissible for the purpose of showing that the defendant is a bad person or is more likely to be guilty of this crime because he has committed crimes in the past. However, as the legislature said when it adopted the present balancing test, Nearly 98% of attorneys and 43% of the judges in a study that the legislature considered indicated their belief that the jury is unable to follow an instruction that tells them consider this evidence on credibility only, not on guilt. That is why under the present law, this evidence is excluded if its prejudicial impact is greater than its probative effect. Two other sections are particularly troubling. The one that provides that a witness may be always present at trial, and the one that restricts that a victim may always be present at trial, and the one that restricts defense attorneys' contact with victims. These are troubling in large part because the definition of victim is so broad that it includes any witness who has suffered an emotional disability as a result of a crime, an eyewitness, for example. All of those people would have an absolute right to be present all the time at trial to shape their testimony however they preferred. And in addition, a defense attorney could not talk to them without a formal, written, or in-person notice informing them that they had the district attorney could be there also. This will, in fact, affect the ability to interview witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I therefore move the substitution of the minority report recommending a no vote on Measure 10.
Wait up here, Corey, in case there's discussion that you may want to answer. There was a second to the minority report. It's been moved and seconded that a minority report be substituted for the majority report, so we will first debate, we'll first be voting on the question of whether to substitute the minority for the majority. However, the debate, I think, will encompass both reports more or less together. So we'll call first anyone who wishes to speak in favor of the measure. Use the microphone at my left.
Marilyn McDonald Smith, member of the Study Committee on Victims' Rights. I would like to urge you to vote in favor of this City Club report, committee report. When we started our investigation, none of us were clear as to how we wanted how to vote on it at the end, and it was well two-thirds, three-quarters of the way into our investigation that we came to our conclusions. I think this is a measure, a law, whose time has come, and it gives the victim a right to their own sense of identity and dignity, something that I feel is not given to the victim under our current system. I urge a yes vote.
Someone speaking against the report, or the measure.
When I appeared before the committee, I told them I had not yet made up my mind which way I was going to vote. I'm obviously been persuaded to vote against it. One of the reasons I was having difficulty, notwithstanding the defects in the measure, in voting against it, is that there were some good things in there, and I also wanted to lean over backwards to give credit to people like Mike Shrunk and people who worked on it for removing some of the worst and most objectionable features of the previous bill. In the final analysis, I decided there were two reasons to vote against it. One, that many of the best provisions in the bill are already in place or can be put in place voluntarily by courts and prosecutors' offices, and in fact, this has been done. The second reason to vote against it is that the defects are such that the matter is going to have to be addressed by the legislature. I'm concerned that in the present climate of near hysteria on the drug wars, it's easier for the legislature to put those things in place which provide for protection for prosecutors and victims than the other way around.
I should have announced at the beginning that because of the length of our program, we're going to have to limit our comments to about a minute each. So next, in favor of the measure.
Chair, Mike Shrunk, City Club member and your district attorney. I've been involved on both sides of council table defending and prosecuting for the last 15 years. Too long we have shunted victims around and the families of victims like pieces of furniture in a courtroom. Too long we have not treated them with dignity and compassion. There are members here that I dare say are probably not going to get up and speak in favor of the bill, but have been shunted around in the courtroom by prosecutors, by defense counsel, and by the system. 2 years ago, The citizens group went out and gathered enough signatures to put ballot measure 8 on the state initiative. We were criticized. Crime Victims United, that same citizen group went out, learned from the criticism, some of it leveled by Mr. Lezak, Mr. Hinkle, other people, members of your club. They crafted a document. Again, they went to the people. They have endorsed it. They have put it on the ballot. It is time that we move forward, that we are lagging behind right now in our rights for victims in this state. Thank you.
Next speaker against the measure.
Charles Davis, member. I think this should be called the Victims Therapy Bill because it certainly is not going to do anything for the criminal justice system, which is in a disastrous position on all levels. I point out that Section 9, which would enable the introduction of testimony of prior convictions, is not going to be erased from the jury's mind any more than it was erased from the mind of the speaker for the majority, who observed that we're all responsible for our behavior. Hence, it wouldn't be so bad if someone's convicted as a result of a prior felony. I think the matter should be defeated.
Next speaker in favor of the measure.
Thank you. I'm Helen Smith, City Club member. As a deputy prosecutor for approximately 8.5 years, I've dealt with victims of domestic violence. I ran a program about 7 years ago. I've dealt with victims of robbery, burglary, rape, theft, just about everything you can find. I've also dealt with the families of homicide victims in this county for 8.5 years. I've seen their frustrations with a system that they perceive to be totally insensitive to their needs and to their feelings. This is a measure that deals not only with their feelings, it protects them, it gives them an opportunity to speak and to participate in a way that they don't presently experience. I strongly urge the City Club to support this measure. Its time has come.
Next speaker against the measure.
Club. On page 137 of the report, it talks about Section 5, the tailoring business. It is a long-standing rule in both civil and criminal trials that witnesses must be excluded, or should be excluded from the courtroom. I don't think the majority here addresses the tailoring of the testimony argument at all. It says that can happen outside the courtroom. That's not the point. The point is to hear the witness on the witness stand and to be able to respond and tailor your testimony to that witness. I think the measure is faulty in that respect. But my real objection goes to the symbolism that's on the next page, the interplay of Section 8 and Section 9. This measure would allow the introduction into evidence of the photograph of the homicide victim. And I ask the club members whether they think a victim of homicide who is 14 years old and blonde and dimpled is more likely to have a photograph introduced into evidence, or whether someone who looks like me or is even fatter and uglier than I would have their picture put in. I think that illustrates that this is a papering over and an emotional appeal and not a real one. I urge a no vote.
Next speaker in favor of the measure.
My name is Ann Harris. I'm a member of the City Club. Excuse me. More importantly, my daughter was a murder victim. I've been through the system. It's true that many of the changes are cosmetic, as was pointed out, but isn't it time that we make a beginning? Cosmetic changes are a start. There are very important changes in there. It is important that a picture of the victim prior to a homicide is there. That's important. It's also important that a victim is allowed to be present in a courtroom when decisions are being made that will directly impact at that point in time that a decision is made, whether guilty or non-guilty, but also will impact the victim and the family members of the victim for years to come. I could go on and go through it section by section. It is a beginning. That is the important point. I urge the City Club to support it by voting yes.
Next speaker against the measure.
Bill Savage, City Club member. I have to commend Mr. Schrunk's office for now having in place through the Victims Assistance Program virtually all of the changes that this measure would enact into law, and he's to be commended for that. However, the extreme prejudice to a person charged with a crime of admitting a prior felony conviction and the fallacy that that's going to be used by the jury not to convict them of the new crime that they're on trial for now, but it's only going to be considered by them with respect to credibility, I think is a fact that makes us think that we're trying to fool ourselves somehow. The fact of the matter is that under the current state of the law, for the fellow who does the bank robbery with the pearl-handled revolver and gives his victim a rose and says thank you as he leaves the bank, the fact that he's done 10 things like that before in that fashion will be admitted in his current robbery trial. But the legislation, the evidence code as it currently stands for felony convictions that don't have particular signature aspects to it, for those prior convictions, it requires the court to entertain the balancing test that we've discussed earlier. That's a good rule and it should be retained. I urge a no vote on the measure.
Is there anyone else who wishes to speak in favor of the measure? If not, we'll have time for two more who are speaking against the measure.
Janie Burkhart, City Club member. I'm presently an attorney with a firm that has a contract for representing indigents in this county, but before that was a victim's advocate in another county and have worked with rape victims. I can tell you that this is not a victim's rights bill. For most victims, there is no defendant who's been caught, and so most victims need a victim assistance program that will help them at the moment, as we have in this county and in most counties. That's where the money needs to go. The money doesn't need to go in increasing parole 600%, which is what this bill would do. This bill would also remove judicial discretion. At the moment, the judge, the ones we've elected, are the ones who make the decision on balancing the prejudice probative factor. They're the people who should have that decision. We should not remove it in this bill and automatically put in evidence prior convictions. What this bill does is to give victims some cosmetic benefits that are already in place, as we've heard, at the benefit of removing rights for the accused. That's not a good benefit, and I urge a no vote.
And the last speaker.
Thank you. John Vasey, City Club member and criminal defense attorney here in a small state to the south, where I participated in a criminal justice study for the Royal Courts in London. I think this bill is a mixed bag with some patently unconstitutional problems in it, and it's more a prosecutor's rights than a victim's rights bill. The parole feature bothers me. It's going to be more expensive, and you will have less people to supervise more criminals out on the street, which means you're going to have more problems. And for that reason, I think that we should reject this and have a better drafted bill. Thank you.
Seeing nobody else wishing to speak on the measure, we will proceed to a vote. And the first vote will be on whether or not to substitute the minority report for the majority report. All those in favor of substituting the minority report, please hold up your pink cards and we'll see whether we need an actual count. Those who are against substituting the minority report, hold up your card. I think maybe we'd better have a count, Nina. Have we got some tellers in place? Again, those who are in favor of substituting the minority report for the majority report, hold up your cards. Those who are opposed to substituting the minority report, hold up your cards. I'll have to take a minute for them to add their additions. Go ahead, Diana.
The vote in favor of the motion to substitute the minority report for the majority is 66, and the vote opposed is 44.
44. The minority report has been substituted for the majority report. We now have a vote on adoption of the minority report as substituted for the majority. All those in favor of the report as substituted, hold up your card, please. Opposed? Hold up. The report has been adopted with the minority report substituted for the majority report. Thank you very much, Peter and Corey and your committee, for their efforts. And we're almost on time. The City Club, in performing its goal of informing its members and the community in public matters, attempts to provide a forum for candidates for the principal public offices. When possible, we attempt to arrange debates between opposing candidates so that our members and the public will have a better chance to evaluate them and their respective positions on the issues. Our established policy is that if one candidate declines to appear, the other candidate who elects to appear will be given the opportunity to speak without opposition. We attempted to arrange a debate for today between Senator Packwood and Representative Bauman, but Senator Packwood declined our invitation. Representative Bauman accepted, and he therefore has the floor today against an empty chair. The format will be that Mr. Bauman will speak for approximately 8 minutes. Then a panel of City Club committee members will ask a total of 4 questions, and we will then have questions from the audience for approximately 15 minutes, after which Mr. Bauman may make a closing statement. The committee members on the panel are Mary Kramer and Norman Eder, both members of the Program Committee of the City Club. Representative Bauman was born in Wisconsin, was educated in California and at Portland State University, and he has served in the Oregon legislature representing a portion of Multnomah County in the sessions of 1979, 81, 83, and 85. In the last 2 sessions, he has been Speaker of the House pro tempore. He is now a candidate for the United States Senate, and we are pleased to have him with us today. Mr. Bauman.
Thank you, Randall, for that introduction, and I've looked forward to this moment because the City Club has played such an important role over the years in determining the outcome of this particular race for this particular Senate seat. This is the second time that a 36-year-old state representative has come before you and asked for your support to become a United States Senator. Last time it happened was Bob Packwood, 18 years ago this very week. And he had a very important question for you when he looked at Wayne Morris, and he said, it's an important consideration for a state like this to turn its back on a senator with so much power, so many powerful friends, and so much money. Well, the question he asked Wayne Morris is the question I asked today. If Wayne Morris were so powerful, he asked, why is Oregon 33rd on the list of states in return of federal tax dollars into our state? Well, Senator Packwood, why today is Oregon 45th on the list of states in return for federal tax dollars? I wish he were here to answer that question. Bob Packwood's blind allegiance to the demands of the Pentagon and to military contractors robs this state of $2 billion of our tax dollars every year. That is our subsidy of the Pentagon. Those dollars today are fueling economic recoveries on the East Coast and in California, but there's no recovery here in Oregon. Unemployment rates in Massachusetts are 3%, Maryland are 4%, California is 6%. Why we have a staggering 9% unemployment. And in the meantime, the deficit runs rampant. $600 million a day. $600 million a day we are running into debt. And Senator Packwood is more than happy to support unworkable but politically expedient schemes like the Graham-Rudman proposal to balance the budget. But when it's time to roll up his sleeves and get to work on the hard decisions it's going to take to put that budget into balance, Bob Packwood's not there. In fact, we just have to look back earlier this month to see some very clear examples of that. When it was time to stand up to balance the budget, to change the way the federal government and funds the Pentagon, a mechanism of funding inflation for the Pentagon, which costs us as taxpayers $44 billion since we last elected Bob Packwood. Bob Packwood said no. He wasn't willing to make that change to save our dollars. $44 billion. That's more money than we, all of us as Oregonians, have paid in income taxes in the last 6 years. It's an astounding amount of money. And what was his excuse? Well, it wasn't germane. It wasn't germane to the reconciliation bill that was before him on October 2nd. Well, he turned around, and the next week he voted for two very germane amendments. One, to study killer bees, and the second, to repay a Civil War debt to the state of Maryland. Senator Packwood, what is germane? I think the most germane thing we need to be concerned about is balancing our state budget. And who does Bob Packwood ask to bear the brunt of these flawed policies? Not the bloated military budgets, and not the rich who have and will continue to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. He asks you and me. He asks it by voting to cut Social Security. He asks it by voting for policies that increase the cost of Medicare. He asks for it by restricting the money that's available to both students and to public education in general. And he asks for it by drying up the money that's available to assist small business. Well, maybe it's not surprising that Bob Packwood doesn't understand what's going on economically in Oregon, because there's prosperity in his hometown, Bethesda, Maryland, but there's no prosperity here in Oregon. And then he gives us this new tax bill. No senator from Oregon would have crafted that bill because it fails on 3 major counts. He did some good things in there. He closed some loopholes that needed to be closed. People that haven't been paying their share will begin to pay their fair share. But what did he do with the money? He gave it right back to the very same people. We had an opportunity finally to do something substantial about balancing our budget, and Bob Packwood said no. It was more important that over half of the taxpayers in this country who earn over $200,000 a year get a tax break averaging over $50,000. That's what that bill does. And at the same time, it raises taxes on 20 million Americans. But he tells us that's just the rich. I'm sorry, Senator Packwood. Your committee says that of those 20 million, 80% earn under $50,000 a year. 6 million Americans earning under $20,000 a year will be paying higher taxes this next year. Well, I'm in this race to fight for change and try to solve these problems, and I'm in this race to build a better Oregon and a safer world, and I'm in this race to win. For 8 years I've been working in Salem to try to bring jobs and prosperity to Oregon. Bring those jobs by building a commitment and a positive relationship between business, workers, the community, and the environment. In leadership on programs like the Oregon Civilian Conservation Corps, where we can put young people to work and do much needed programs in this state. Because of my leadership, we no longer tell families in this state that if they're in trouble, they have to split up if they want assistance. And we've adopted a program that will provide quality health care for Oregonians in need. We have a program now of supported employment, which allows the handicapped to work and to prosper and to give back. Well, I want to fight for a new definition of national security. It'll include quality education in its definition. It'll include decent jobs, and it'll include dignity and security for our senior citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, the monuments of the Packwood years are shameful. Mindless growth in nuclear arsenals, substantial and sustained unemployment, and a staggering deficit. I pledge to you today my program, a program that will stop the runaway excesses of the military budget, which only gives us a false sense of security. It will create jobs by investing here in our state and in all of our citizens, and will return Oregon tax dollars to Oregon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bauman. We now come to the time for questions, and our panel from the City Club Program Committee will ask the first 4 questions. First from Mary Kramer.
Mr. Bauman, during the past several years, the congressional budgetary and appropriations process has become paralyzed. Can we continue government by continuing resolution? And if so, are there any options?
Yes, there are. The options are hard work and people willing to come to grips with the decision. Every time, working with my colleagues, seeing a couple of them in the audience, every time, even during the darkest days of this recession, when we left Salem, we left a balanced budget behind. We were willing to make those decisions. Bob Packwood has stated last year that the reason he would support some of these schemes is because the Congress doesn't have the discipline to come to grips with those. Well, my answer is let's send some disciplined congressmen to Washington instead of burdening ourselves with phony schemes like the Graham-Rudman proposal.
The next question is from Norman Eder.
Mr. Bauman, it appears that the Strategic Defense Initiative has become a major roadblock to arms control negotiations. As a freshman senator, what position will you take on the future of Star Wars research, development, and deployment?
It seems absolutely astounding to me. I mean, look what happened this last weekend. We are on the verge of a historic agreement, and the one roadblock was a scheme that virtually united scientists who don't have an economic interest in it, think is unworkable, impractical, and even if it could be built, could be sabotaged easily. That is what's standing in the way of us in meaningful arms reduction. I don't think it's any accident that Bob Packwood cast the critical vote last summer to put no limit on that program, and I don't think it's an accident that he has received more campaign contributions from SDI contractors than any other member of the U.S. Senate.
The next question is from Mary Kramer again.
Mr. Bauman, you have criticized Senator Packwood for not taking a strong stand against Hanford being the nation's nuclear waste repository. What do you think Senator Packwood could have done when Hanford appeared on the list of candidate sites?
The first thing we heard out of Senator Packwood was last July 10th, and he came here and he said, don't worry, as long as I'm your senator, we aren't going to have a dump at Hanford. But where was he when we needed him back in 1982 when that policy in the National Waste Policy Act was being adopted, and there was an amendment to give Oregon, a state like Oregon, status as an affected state and give it a veto? He said no. Where was he when there was an amendment offered that year that said we have to look for a safe site anywhere in the country? He said no, it needs to be a West Coast site, or west of the Mississippi site. That's not the type of leadership we want. The first list had 29 sites. Scientifically, Hanford was rated 29th. The next list had 9 sites. Hanford was rated 9th. And now it's 3rd on a list of 3. If Bob Packwood has so darn much clout, it shouldn't be on the list in the first place.
We come now to questions from the floor. We have approximately 10 minutes, and you may use either microphone. Please identify yourself as a club member. Try to keep your questions down to about 30 seconds so that the answers can be about a minute apiece.
Dave Jones, club member. A man named James Buchanan won the Pulitzer Prize for talking about politics, and he said that politicians, office holders, vote on the basis of their self-interest, and that they vote for programs and against taxes, and they do not bite the bullet. Would you?
I will promise to you votes for a balanced budget, and that will mean three things. First, get rid of the bloat, particularly in the military budget. Build equity back into our tax system so that people are paying their fair share. And third, restructure our programs, particularly given my background in the human resource programs, so we use that money to have a positive influence on people's lives, to provide the services they need to get them off of welfare, out of a homeless condition, take care of their medical problem, provide the daycare they need in a meaningful way, and get them back and off of our financial backs and contributing to society once again.
We will alternate between the microphones, so the one on my right next.
Thank you. Bill Savage from the Law and Public Safety Standing Committee. The violent crime issue is one that affects a large number of Americans, and we would appreciate hearing your position concerning a national handgun control bill.
Reminds me of my favorite question of the campaign. It came at Newport about 3 weeks ago, and the guy said, well, I liked your speech, and I couldn't vote for Packwood, but I just have one question. How do you stand on abortion, gay rights, and gun control? We have to come to grips with something in this country. In no country in the world, save the United States, are more than 1,000 people killed a year by handguns. In the United States, over 10,000 die each year. There should be no room in Congress or at the state legislature, absolutely no room for intervening in a person's right to hunt, to own those guns, to collect guns. But we do have to come to grips someday with the problem of Saturday night specials and the small guns that have such a deadly impact in this country.
Next question.
Thank you very much. I'd like to suppose, if I could, that there's a vote on the Senate floor today. Many times senators must walk into the Senate chamber and vote yes or no without any additional changes. We know how both of our existing senators feel on this issue, and I'd like to ask if you'd vote yes or no on the Hells Canyon Wilderness Bill.
The bill is not on the floor. I support wilderness area, and particularly there needs to be some more protections in the Hells Canyon region. I think in terms of working with the local population, the work I've done with them earlier this year, the solution is probably not continuing expansion of the wilderness area, though it's probably more a national park or national scenic area status, where we'll actually get some access into the area and provide some economic stability for the area. We also need to do a better job of managing and getting resources to the Forest Service so that we can better manage our public lands and don't have this continual pressure growing between the people who want a sustained supply of timber and the people who want to protect wilderness, because you don't have to have that if you're managing the areas where we are cutting timber well.
So you oppose the bill?
No. There's no bill on the floor. I support the wilderness area. The exact bill, I think, does need some amendment, but I'm not opposing wilderness for Hells Canyon.
Thank you.
Next question.
Ray Polani, a member of the City Club. Representative Bauman, there's a very serious situation that is developing in our country which affects our ability to compete economically in the world. And that has to do with the fact that for the first time in the last couple of years, more interstate freight has been carried by trucks, by long-distance trucks, than by railroads. Senator Packwood appears to be in favor of the so-called hub bill that would make Salt Lake City the hub for long-distance trucks in the West, where they would be able to be wider, longer, and heavier. Where would you stand on that bill?
Well, Ray, I don't know the details of that bill at all, but I do tell you that the type of proposal I'm talking about, and when I talk about reinvesting in Oregon and taking our tax dollars back home, it's instead of spending money on an MX missile, spend it to do the improvements we need in the highways. Highway 97, for example, tremendous amount of hazardous material traveling over that road. It should be improved. It should be widened. The cost of one MX could do that. We need a decent transportation corridor between I-5 and the coast, both at Coos Bay and on the north coast. It needs to be done. It can be done if we get our priorities straight. We have to assure in doing that the safety standards, and I'm sorry I don't know more about the proposal that you asked.
Next question.
Cindy Durham, City Club member. Mr. Bauman, Congress has already cut $30 billion out of President Reagan's defense budget. How much more do you propose to cut? Specifically, where would you make the cuts? And the money saved, would you take that towards social programs or reducing the deficit?
I would cut approximately in this budget about $60 billion further. It would come out of particularly the major weapons systems portions of the budget. It would come out of better procurement practices. It would come out of actually asking to do a very simple thing, test the weapons, independently test them before they build them, and would come out of this inflation factor that they get about $9 billion a year from and they haven't corrected. Whether this would go to social programs, our first priority has to be to balance the budget. What we need to do is restructure those social programs so they're actually intervening when there's a need to intervene in someone's life. It's done in a positive way, not in a restricting and a way that builds dependence, like so much of our welfare programs do today.
Thank you.
Next question from this microphone.
Mr. Bauman, Jill Island, City Club member.
Hi, Jill.
Your state legislative record, voting record, heavily favors the Portland area and often to the detriment of the rest of the state of Oregon. An example would be perhaps the way you stood on use of state lottery funds to build economic development in the smaller communities in Oregon. As a United States Senator, how would you fairly represent all the needs of all Oregonians, especially those outside the Portland area?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm sorry your facts are wrong, however. I think my record is, I took very seriously the first term, the first word in my title, in being a state representative. And I think I demonstrated that commitment during the primary when I walked across the state and worked in jobs all around this state. I think the important question for Oregonians on November 4th is, are we going to have an Oregonian representing us or not? That's the critical choice.
Thank you.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions, if I estimate correctly. So next one from the left, please.
Barbara Judlow, City Club. Oregon historically does not favor defense spending, nor does it receive a great amount of defense dollars. Clearly, Washington and California benefit from defense contracts, and California and Florida receive extensive entitlement funds because of a large retirement population. Since Oregon's never going to be a Sunbelt state, nor a major defense contractor, how would you bring additional federal dollars into the state as a freshman senator?
I think by my victory, there'll be a message sent. One is that no, there is no realignment going on in this country, that the people of the states, and particularly in this case of Oregon, are willing to make common sense decisions. And the first thing I'll do to help this state will be my commitment and my hard work to bring a balanced budget, because that will do more for Oregon than anything else. And the second commitment is to try to take those dollars that are being so poorly spent now on programs that only give us weapons and radioactive waste and a false sense of security, and take those dollars and try to redirect them here at home to put people to work on some of those projects I mentioned earlier. It is a big challenge. A freshman senator, any senator, never can turn the world around by himself, but it will be our statement as Oregonians that we think there's a better way.
Thank you.
I'll take a chance and try to honor all the 3 questions of people who are now standing. So the next one from the right, please.
Kathy Young, City Club. Ron Wyden and Les Aucoin both voted for the tax reform. Neil Goldschmidt publicly supports the tax reform bill, as does Brock Adams in Washington. Are these other Democrats out of step, and do you believe that they don't have the Pacific Northwest's best interest in heart?
I can't speak for anybody else who's running for their own seat. I will speak for myself. On just the first standard alone, the bill is a failure. It was the best political opportunity we've had in a long time to do something about balancing the budget, not by a general tax increase, only by asking people to pay their fair share, and he blew it. What the other decisions that other people seeking office, how they weigh those decisions, that's up to them. That's the standard I use, and I reject the bill.
Thank you.
One more question?
Yes, Rick, I'm Bill Gordon, member of the City Club. Rick, you probably know that in 1985 we spent something like $425 billion on health care in the United States. I looked at the figures for Sweden, which has a much superior system than we have, and they spent nowhere near that amount, which included long-term care. How do you stand on a national health security program?
I am committed to a right that every American have access to quality health care. If we commit to that, and if we move to that in a system that is right for America, we will probably save money. The system we have now is absolutely astounding. What it basically forces people to do is to get very, very sick before we'll care, we as the state, the government in general. And what that does is that means we're going to pay the bill at the emergency room, where it's a much higher bill. Let's make a commitment to preventative care, and let's make a commitment to good access to primary care. When we do that, we'll have a healthier population, we'll have better employees, we'll be saving money, and I think beyond all the economic arguments, it's just the right thing to do for people.
Now our last question from the floor, please.
Rick, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I am interested in a little bit more about the tax bill. I think that part of the principle involved was to give relief to people that were on welfare, single parents, underprivileged minority. In spite of the things that you mentioned in terms of kind of statistics of how many save and how many paid, do you think it accomplishes those objectives? And then could you repeat for us again the three major reasons why you felt that it was flawed? Because I couldn't follow all those besides the balanced budget. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Ted. The three reasons are tax neutrality, tax equity, which is the first part of your question, and the retroactivity, where we have made a commitment, for example, to the small woodlot growers and Christmas tree farmers, that they could plant a crop and invest for 10 years or so and reap a harvest under a certain set of rules. We are changing the rules retroactively. I think that's the third failing of the bill. The question of the effect of the bill on low income. Well, there's Senator Packwood's statistics. You're earning $10,000 a year. On average, you'll save $35. That's good, and that's fine. What he doesn't tell you is what the effect of the rest of the bill is. If you're earning $10,000, chances are you're a renter. The bill, almost everybody agrees, is going to have an upward pressure on rents anywhere from 10 to 30%. So that $35 that you save on April 15th in your taxes, you're going to pay right back to your landlord on May 1st, and again on June 1st and July 1st, and who's the real winners? It's not the low income, it's not the middle class.
Mr. Bauman, we've encroached a little bit on the time for your closing statement in order to give an opportunity for questions, and you have about 2 or 3 minutes for a final statement.
Thank you. I'll close briefly. There's a question, important question before you. Is this our Senate seat? Does it belong to the 2.5 million of us who are Oregonians? I wanted to show you one thing. We're looking through Senator Packwood's financial records, and we just looked for people from the insurance industry giving him money. And we only looked in 1/2 of 1985, people giving over $200. Most of them $1,000 contributors. Through the same period, we asked them about Oregon. Who gave them money from Oregon? That's the list. This Senate seat doesn't belong to Bob Packwood, it belongs to us. It's our seat. And what I hope you've learned from me in this campaign and today is a consistency and a commitment to who we are as Oregonians and where we're going. And no, I haven't had the opportunity to dine with presidents and counsel with prime ministers and kings, but I have had the rare privilege of walking and talking and working with the people of the state of Oregon. And what I'm asking you to let me do is go back to Washington and continue that commitment. Thank you very much.
very much, Representative Bauman. We appreciate you coming with us today. We are now adjourned. Remember, a debate next week, and the following week, about a half a dozen committee reports.